All right, back again. I'm Jordan, and what I'd like to do here is show you a former BYU professor. As I've stated earlier, I am at BYU right now, and I'm in the Accounting 200 class. And this is a former professor, but obviously they've got pre-recorded lessons that you do online. So in this, it's talking about payroll taxes and how you do accounting for payroll taxes. And Professor Norm here, he goes on to a bit of a soapbox about payroll taxes. And I'd like to share that with you because I think it's insightful. I realize that when you're going to, let's say, appeal to authority, it's not necessarily going to be a good idea in the sense that, let's say, I can find, for example, one BYU professor that happens to agree with me politically or in any other way, because someone else could just find another BYU professor that thinks the opposite and disagrees. So I'm not trying to do this in a sense that I'm saying, oh, I found a BYU professor that agrees with me about taxes, because that's something that, anyone else can just go find someone else to rebut that. But I do think that, as I've stated earlier, that when it comes to thinking about these issues and how the church doctrine plays a role in forming opinions about these issues, about government, about society, about cultural issues, I think it's important to at least look at the perspective of the people who are in positions of authority. Now, I don't want to do like the back and forth between BYU professors because I don't ultimately think that they are in positions of authority when it comes to religious matters. They're obviously in positions of authority when it comes to academic matters, but those are different than religion. And if you're going to use religion as your foundation for establishing your opinions and beliefs in politics or cultural issues, then it would make sense to appeal to religious leaders. Now, there's a reason why I'm using this particular BYU professor. He is a former professor and is currently serving as a 70. Now, granted, that doesn't necessarily give his thoughts and opinions any more sway. But I do think it's interesting that, at least from my perspective when I look at it, if you were to ask all of the church leaders, from the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, all of the Quorums of the 70, I think that what you'd find is most of them vote Republican. They're registered Republicans and they vote Republican. And I think that's insightful because if you really think about it from the opposite perspective, if I were a Democrat or a progressive or whatever, if I wanted to really just try to provide a religious backbone to my beliefs, then at some point you're going to have to say, well, because the church's stance on this is this particular way, that's why I have these political leanings. And what you'll find is that, and this is something I'll do over time with other people, and usually I'll take talks from General Conference or the writings of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. But this is just an interesting example that I think, well, I think it's enjoyable. I think it's funny that he gets on his soapbox here and talks about taxes. But ultimately, I think that what you'll find is when the vast majority of church leaders who are encouraging us to be politically active in whatever legal capacity we can within our individual countries, if they themselves have a particular political leaning, don't you think that at their level of understanding, or their alleged level of understanding of the gospel and of the plan of salvation, of the doctrine of the kingdom of God, why would they have certain political leanings if they were not in line with the doctrine of the kingdom? And granted, there's different ways that you can interpret it. There's obviously going to be some people in general church leadership that have completely different opinions, opposing opinions and beliefs when it comes to political matters, cultural issues, social issues. But I don't think it's something that should be ignored. That I'm going to say, I honestly, I don't know because they don't make it public. But if I had to guess, just based on my lifetime in the church, my political awakening, so to say, and trying to really understand politics in relation to religion, I think that the vast majority, at least 80 to 90% of general church leadership, are what would be considered right-wing, or more, I think more appropriately, more accurately, would be considered libertarian. And I think that that matters to me when I look at it, but we'll see. As I post more stuff, I think I'll build my case more that when seemingly all of the church leaders tend to stick to a certain line of messaging that correlates with libertarian ideals when it comes to government, what the role of government is, what the government should do. But anyways, I'm getting way off track. I'm gonna just play this, and I might stop it a couple times if I want to share some thoughts, but I think it'll be interesting for people to listen to from the perspective of an accountant, for whatever that's worth, and also a successful businessman in his own right before he came and taught at BYU. But here we go. Take a listen to what he has to say.
You know, why does the state and federal government require an employer to withhold and pay directly these various amounts on behalf of the employee? I mean, why not pay the employee the full $1,000 and let the employee pay their own FICA taxes and their own federal income tax and state income tax? What do you think? Well, some people have suggested that maybe the federal and state governments don't really trust us to pay our own taxes. If they gave us the money, the full $1,000, we'd be kind of hesitant to cut a check and give it back to the government. So instead of us actually getting that money, why don't, we'll just never give it to the employee in the first place, and we'll make it legally required that the employer pay that. Some people have suggested that maybe the governments are doing this because they want to earn interest on our money. I mean, if we were to get our cash and hold on to it before paying our income taxes at the end of the year or something like that, we'd be earning interest on our own money before paying it to the government. Maybe the government wants to get it more quickly so that they can be earning interest on it rather than us, the employee. I suppose, there might be some explanation too, that the federal government needs money along the way during the year in order to pay the various bills of government, so it makes sense for them to collect the cash along the way. I suppose you can reach any conclusion that you want to, possibly based on your political persuasion, as to the motivation for this requirement for withholdings by employers. But
I think that's interesting, just when he says you could reach any conclusion you want to based on your political persuasion. I think that's indicative of the way that we view politics and our own personal understanding of the way things work, especially recently with the whole idea and concept of my truth, and as opposed to the truth, as if those are two different things, that you can have your own independent personal truth that supersedes the truth. To me, that seems a little bogus, considering that as a church, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ, we understand that there is such a thing as the truth. There is objective truth in the world and in the eternities. Now, that's not to say that each person can't have an individual understanding of the truth, an individual response to the truth, but it is still the truth. So when it comes to the reasons why government has mandated that employers withhold taxes from their employees' paychecks, I don't know, I think that's funny that he brings that up, not really, but the idea that your political persuasion could influence what you think might be the reason, when if you look at it, there is a reason. There is the reason why the government has done that. He doesn't get into that because you can convince yourself of anything if you really want to. But I think that he delves a little bit deeper into it, and he really kind of subtly hints at the way, or the reason why he thinks the government collects income taxes the way they do through the withholding system. So let's continue with that.
Tell you this, the effect and impact of this withholding of taxes, I think, is something that's very, very damaging, I believe, maybe to the nation. Now, I don't mean to get into some political soapbox here, but let's face it, people have become desensitized to how much they actually pay in taxes because they never really get their full gross pay in total and then actually cut a check paying their taxes. I've asked students sometimes, how much did you pay in income taxes last year? And they don't have a clue. The reason is they never got the money in the first place, and they don't really keep track of how much has been withheld. In fact, some of these people have more than is required to be withheld, and they actually look forward to a refund the following year of overpaid income taxes. Now, this is really stupid. Some of these students or people think, hey, the government's actually paying me money, some kind of a bonus or something. This isn't what's happening. You've actually overpaid your taxes, and now the government's going to give back what you overpaid, by the way, without any interest. They were using your money, and now they're giving it back to you and not paying you any interest.
I like the strong language he uses where he says that it's really stupid. The idea that people don't actually know how much they make, granted, it shows on your pay stub for any of you who have had a job before. I realize I'm trying to talk to my fellow BYU students, but also all the members of the church. And any of you who have had a job before, you look at your pay stub and you see how much gets taken out. Now, granted, most people, myself included, I've done the same thing. I just look at my net pay because I know that's how much I'm actually bringing home. That's what I can count on to pay bills with. I can't look at the gross number and say, oh, that's how much money I have to pay bills with, because I never actually get that money. And the level of, I don't quite know how to say it, the level of thinking that is done by individuals versus the amount of thinking that is done for them by the government is a ratio that I think, well, ever since the government was formed, but let's just say recently, the last 10, 15, 20 years maybe, that ratio for how much you think for yourself versus how much the government either says that they need to think for you or legislates that they need to think for you is increasing in favor of the government thinking for us. For example, his reasoning is that if we got our full paycheck and then we had to cut a check back to the government, there would be a lot of irresponsibility. A lot of people would spend all of the money that they get, and then when it comes time for taxes, well, they're not going to have any money in their checking account to cut a check to the government. And that would be a huge problem for the government because, sure, you can put someone on back taxes. A lot of people owe back taxes. But the simple fact of the matter is the government isn't getting that money. If the government's not getting that money, then they don't have the money to fund the government. So it can't really be done that way. The government needs their money, but that's ignoring the deficit spending issue. So it's debatable whether the government actually needs your money or not, but they definitely take it. And I think that it's, to me, alarming and disconcerting, the amount of thinking that is done for people by the government and by a lot of other individuals who have the public's interest in mind, which I think is just a deceptive term. And I'll just get into it. So, real quick, I'll do a longer video on this topic specifically. But when you look at the plan of salvation, and specifically the pre-earth life, what all of this is based on, it's based on agency, our ability to choose, to be presented with options and to choose. That is an intrinsic ability that we have. It's a gift from God. Why would it make sense to give that up? to say, you know what would be better than me thinking for myself is to let someone else think for me. Now, I realize I'm just touching the surface of this. I'm not doing a whole lot because I'm going to get back to what Elder Nemro says, but I realize that a quick rebuttal that you're probably thinking is, well, obviously I listen to experts and professionals about stuff and I take advice from people. That's not quite the same thing. And like I say, I'll do a dedicated video just to this topic later, but for now, the basic idea I want to get across is we should strive to think for ourselves, and that includes the prerequisite knowledge and learning that goes into what do we need to know in order to make wise decisions, instead of just pawning it off. Let's let the government decide for us. But anyway, off of my soapbox, let's let Elder Nemro get back on his.
You know, when you don't really know how much income tax you pay, you don't really truly understand and feel the cost of government. It seems to me, and I heard this even back when I was at school, this whole process of withholding not only has desensitized people to how much tax we pay, it's kind of numbed them to the whole doggone process. Most people, when they think about their paycheck now, don't even think in terms of what my gross salary or wage is. They say, hey, I make so much net. I mean, that's how they think of their salary and wages in terms of net terms. That money really wasn't mine, I guess, in the first place. You know, some people have suggested in some of the debates relative to tax reform that we ought to eliminate this whole concept of withholding, that we ought to give employees all of the money, the full $1,000. Again, then it would be a very simple entry. The employer would simply credit cash and debit wage expense, and the employee would cut the checks to the government. I'm going to guess that if we did that, you'd probably have a serious tax revolt in this nation. If a person had to sit down every month or at least quarterly or annually and actually write a check to the government, and they say, wow, I didn't know I was paying that much in taxes, they probably would take various tax legislation a lot more seriously.
I have just an open-ended question. I'm not going to give the answer to this necessarily, but I think you might be able to guess what my opinion on this is. If I were to ask you, how much do you think the government actually needs? I mean, it's obviously available to the public. It's not hidden information, but that doesn't mean that everyone looks it up and knows what it is. It doesn't necessarily get reported on the news in a sort of repetitive fashion necessary for it to sink into just everyone's mind when they're watching the news randomly. But how much does the government need to operate? How much tax dollars do they need? Does the government need to collect in tax receipts and tax revenue to operate? And then this is getting back into the deficit spending, but how much do they need, and then how much do they spend? Because those are not the same thing. And then here's the open-ended question. That's all just a lead up. The open-ended question is, how much should the government need? How much should it need? And there's a lot more thought that goes into that than just, well, I don't know, just throw out a random number. Because the government doesn't need that much. When you look at what the government is supposed to be doing, should be doing, the limited amount of responsibilities that the government, I think, should have, can be covered by significantly less money than what we're currently giving it. And what we're currently giving the government is significantly less than what they're actually spending. But that's a question that I think, I just think it's insightful, kind of like how Elder Nemro said, if you actually received your full paycheck and then had to cut a check back to the government, and you saw that difference, it would be a lot more impactful to you how much taxes you're actually paying. And I think the same can be true in a bit more removed fashion. If you actually look at what the government is spending, what it's collecting, and how much you're paying, like the relationship between all of those things. And once you see just how much the government spends and break it down by programs or departments, and it's a bit outrageous, in my opinion. But let's finish this up. There's about 2 minutes left.
Well, off of my soapbox, and proceeding forward. The second form of payroll tax is referred to as employer payroll taxes. The first one was the employees' payroll taxes. These are taxes that are the employee's cost or taxes to be paid to the government by the employer through withholding. An employer's payroll tax is a tax on employers for the simple privilege of having employees. Wow, this is a tremendous job incentive program. You know, we want people to hire other people and create jobs in this country. I tell you what, let's go ahead and if you're going to employ somebody, we're going to tax the living daylights out of you. That's some great incentive, isn't it?
All right, this will probably be the last comment I make last time I interrupt him. This is something that, as far as I know, I think Adam Smith was the first one to really tie incentives to money. And what he really discovered is, you know, if you pay someone to do something, more than likely they're going to do it. And if you keep paying them, they're going to keep doing it. And in a broad sense, in an economic sense, the general idea here is that if you pay people to do something, you're going to get more of that thing. Whatever it is you're paying them to do, you're going to get more of it. Whereas if you, let's say, tax people, if you take money away from them, then you're going to get less of whatever that is. And you can try to debate that if you want, but it is a pretty solid economic principle. So think about that in relation to this. We want people to have jobs and to make money, but when employers do that, they get taxed. So do you think that's helping them to employ people and pay them, or hurting them?
Uh-oh, I'm back on my soapbox for a moment. But that's effectively what's happening through this thing called employers' payroll taxes. The employer payroll tax is comprised of FICA taxes. This is Social Security and Medicare, and the amount that the employer pays is an amount equal to that of the employee. The total amount of FICA taxes collected by the federal government, half of it comes from employees and half of it comes from employers. So employers are also making a contribution to the Social Security program. In addition, there's something referred to as federal unemployment insurance. I like to call that FUI. There's also something referred to as state unemployment insurance. I like to call that SUI. Now, there is some practical reasoning behind these various employer payroll taxes that ought to be considered. The fact of the matter is, as many people would suggest, and it seems rational to me, that employers should be making some contribution to a program that ultimately provides some retirement benefit to the employees. So for FICA and Medicare, for employers to pay something into that program may make some sense. In addition, federal unemployment insurance and state unemployment insurance are programs operated by the federal and state governments such that if an employee loses their job for at least a period of time, they will have some benefits through the federal and state programs to give them some source of income while they're in the process of trying to obtain a new job. Again, maybe that's an appropriate contribution for an employer, to make a contribution to a program that actually funds unemployment insurance for laid off employees. However, let's be real honest here. The fact of the matter is that employers theoretically are incurring a legitimate cost here. We're going to be crediting cash, and we'll go over the journal entry here in just a moment, and debiting a payroll tax expense for the amount of these taxes. Theoretically, an employer would be just as well off to pay out these taxes, but to simply increase, instead of paying them to the government, simply increase the amount of the salary or wage to the employee. If we eliminated these taxes, theoretically, a business could simply pay more to their employees. Of course, some people would suggest, how likely is that? Will an employer actually do that? And in fact, these employees do need these various benefits. Again, these are issues that have some political persuasion in terms of the arguments. But you do need to know here that effectively what we're saying is that employers pay taxes for the privilege of having employees. How would we account for this employer payroll tax? Let's look.
All right, well, that's about all that he really discusses on that issue in his soapbox moment. But hopefully that was insightful. I guess I thought it was insightful when I first saw it, especially considering in general, even here at BYU, how left-leaning a lot of the professors are, a lot of the programs, and I wouldn't say quite as far as other schools, but it's still obvious and apparent that there's a lot of people with a very left-leaning bias, and so this was a wonderful little surprise, at least for me, to go through the online lessons and come across this soapbox moment. But that's it for now. Hopefully you enjoyed it. and I'll see you again later.